Hi, everyone. I apologize for being a few minutes late here for my psychological safety webinar. I hope everyone is doing well today. This is definitely meant to be interactive, and I'm here to talk about psychological safety. By all means, please stick your comments and questions there in the comments box, and I'm happy to answer them all along the way as we go. So let's go ahead and jump in. Just to introduce myself, again, I'm Catherine Mattice. I'm the founder and CEO of Civility Partners, and we are an organization focused on creating positive workplace cultures. And with that mission, we often end up going into toxic work environments and working specifically in that area. I got into this whole thing because of my own experiences working with someone who is a bully. I was the director of HR and just experienced a lot of the drama and trauma that goes along with that. I personally felt bullied by this individual. And then as the director of HR was dealing with all of the psychological and organizational problems that come along with that. So there were lots of people, coming to me for help, and I wasn't able to help them because I couldn't get the president to agree that there was a problem that needed to be addressed. So let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to talk about a variety of negative behaviors. We're going to talk about what civility and psychological safety are. We're going to talk about how psychological safety gets undermined, and ultimately how to measure and track psychological safety. And this is an important conversation because we don't talk about psychological safety enough. I've been talking about it for over a decade in my work doing workplace bullying work, right? But it's become a pretty popular term lately with Google releasing a report that said that after studying the teams inside Google, they found the ones that were most effective were the ones that were had this psychological safety. That was the number one thing that effective teams had. And so they sort of popularized this term. And then if you think about all of the DEI work that's been happening lately, psychological safety definitely becomes part of that conversation as well. People, if we're talking about people being able to be their whole selves and being included, they certainly have to feel safe to be their whole selves. One thing I noticed a lot is that the advice around behavior, how to solve behavior, toxic behavior, how to create certain kinds of behavior, I feel like a lot of the advice is always around training and policy. So for example, in the world of harassment prevention, we're doing trainings on that topic. And the law sort of assumes that if you have a policy in place and you train your people, that somehow that's going to create a culture where there isn't harassment. And of course, we know that can't be farther from the truth. So this is a much better way to look at how to create a certain kind of culture, one of psychological safety, one of customer service orientation, one of, whatever you want your culture to be, culture of innovation. You have to think about these three buckets. It's not just training and policy. So leaders have to do with any person in the organization who has a leadership quality. So I'm not just talking about the owners or the C-suite or people with the title of leadership. For example, you might have a receptionist who people are drawn to because he or she has a great personality and sort of comes across as a leader in the way that they communicate. So that's a leader that you could tap into. That's an organizational champion that you could tap into to influence the culture. Policy is also important. So you definitely need to have policies around things like equity and inclusion and harassment prevention. And you have your core values, which in some ways are an organizational policy if you're holding people accountable to living them. But I see so many organizations that have core values, but they don't actually live them, or they have a harassment prevention policy, but they don't actually follow their own rules. And so, of course, just having the policy isn't enough. It's got to be lived out and addressed, and you have to follow those policies. And then lastly, behavior. Behavior is the other component to whatever kind of culture you're trying to create. In this case, we're talking about a culture of psychological safety. But if you think about the way people interact at work, if the organization has a message that, for example, we want to be really inclusive here, we're really focused on equity and inclusion, but the behavior doesn't match that statement, then all of that's out the window. Let me give you an example. I specialize in coaching people who engage in workplace bullying, and or toxic behaviors, aggressive behavior. Doesn't necessarily have to be bullying. But what happens is I've got HR calling me to say, we've got this issue. Can you please help? This person needs some coaching. And they've been doing this for 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years, but they finally crossed a line. And so now we need to address it. But I'm thinking, well, gosh, you've been doing harassment prevention training all this time. Let's look at that mixed message. So you have behavior that somebody's engaging in, and an organization that's not following its policy, leadership isn't stepping in. So the messaging is off. So if somebody watches a harassment prevention training, for example, but they know that this VP over here is allowed essentially to act a certain way, then that training is out, it's all moot. It doesn't matter. The organizational members are going to see right through that. So this is how you create a certain kind of a culture. So I want to talk about the negative behavior spectrum, just so we get clear on how all of these behaviors work together. I often see where we're talking about behaviors in a bucket, like harassment's its own bucket, it's its own animal. And that's not necessarily realistic. I understand why the law has to put things in buckets, but that's not reality. So we can't rely on the law to inform how these behaviors actually work from a kind of a social anthropological point of view. So at one end of the spectrum, at the low end of the spectrum, is incivility, unprofessionalism, and microaggressions. And these are sort of lower level behaviors that we often overlook. So you have somebody who makes sarcastic remarks, or someone who asks inappropriate questions, or microaggressions are lots of different things. Somebody who grandstands over somebody else in order to get attention, and so on and so forth. And these are behaviors that we often just sort of leave alone because there isn't a law that says you can't be uncivil. It feels like we're micromanaging if we're addressing it. We often don't really know what to do with it. I mean, if you're in a meeting and someone makes an inappropriate, sarcastic joke that's sort of uncivil, what do you do with that? And so I think people feel like, well, it's not really my business, or we'll just brush it off. But what happens with that reaction is that those behaviors escalate into bullying. So in all of the research around workplace bullying over 40 years from around the world, I can tell you that bullying rarely happens straight out the gate. People bully because they've been allowed to engage in lower level behaviors over time, and they figured out that those behaviors work for them. And eventually those behaviors cross a line into bullying. So that behavior becomes more and more normal for them, and they become desensitized to their own behavior and to the reactions that their behavior has. And so if we can address incivility and unprofessionalism and microaggressions, these sort of lower level behaviors, if we can address those early on, then bullying will be minimized. Incivility also causes a lack of psychological safety. So again, if organizations are claiming that they want inclusive, equitable work environments, the behavior, we hear DEIB, DIBS, the behavior has to match that messaging. And so you have to create psychological safety by also addressing these lower level behaviors. So just to kind of finish out this conversation around bullying, the law really describes abusive conduct and bullying differently. Now, I'm in California, where there is a law around abusive conduct. There are many states with no laws around abusive conduct, but they're really very differently defined. But I'm here to tell you, as someone who's been in this world for about 15 years and have read thousands of research articles and consulted with tons of organizations and interacted with so many people, that bullying and harassment are actually the same exact behavior. The only difference is who you aim that behavior at. So if I bully everyone, that's abusive conduct, and that's okay. If I bully only people of a certain age or race or religion and so forth, then that is harassment. And so the behaviors, though, are the same. It's just the context that makes a difference. And then, of course, another sort of category of bullying is group bullying. So things like hazing, which does definitely happen in organizations. So at the farther end of the spectrum then is workplace violence, and violence and bullying definitely cross over as well. So for example, if you have somebody who creates fear in others, let's say, for example, one of my coaching clients, he used to lean over the table and sort of get right in someone's face and say something really nasty to them. That's workplace violence. So violence isn't just touching someone in terms of punching or threatening to hurt them. Violence can be those subtle types of aggressive behavior where people feel afraid. So if somebody's sort of consistently engaging in this, getting in personal space with this aggressive tone and aggressive facial expression, and their chest is puffed up, I'm afraid. And that counts as workplace violence. So I just, hopefully this kind of highlighting of how these behaviors work helps. So let's talk about incivility. Incivility is defined again as disrespect or rudeness. And ultimately why it's a problem and how it hinders psychological safety is that it's a small little subtle indicator that you don't value someone. So if you send off an uncivil email, if you cut someone off, if you cut someone off, interrupt them or cut them off in the freeway, I guess, if you're, these little tiny pokes of disrespect or rudeness, they're ultimately saying, I don't value you. That's why I interrupt you. I don't care what you have to say, right? And so psychological safety, just to clarify what these are, psychological safety is the belief that there's no negative consequences for being yourself or for speaking up or for asking a question, for having some crazy idea that just might work. And so if we're going to talk about equity and inclusion, we have to talk about psychological safety. People can't be their true selves. They can't be included if there's some evidence around them that the organization doesn't allow them to be themselves. This is a great quote from the Center for Creative Leadership, that a psychologically safe workplace begins with the feeling of belonging, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which shows that all humans require their basic needs to be met before they can reach their full potential. Employees must feel accepted before they're able to improve their organizations. And what the Center for Creative Leadership is referring to is essentially Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So according to Maslow, let me move this little thing over out of the way. According to Maslow, we need our physiological needs met, which would be things like food and water and, sleep and all of that. And once those things are met, then we can start focusing on our safety. Now, perhaps when Maslow created this, he was thinking of physical safety, but we can add in psychological safety now too. So once our basic sort of animal needs are met, then we can start focusing on safety. We focus on making sure we have a safe car that's going to take us home safely at night, that we, can live in a place where we feel safe and so on, but also that we feel psychologically safe. And only then, when we feel psychologically and physically safe, can we start focusing on feeling like we belong and that we're valued. And only if you feel valued can you have healthy self-esteem. And only if you have healthy self-esteem can you self-actualize, which for a business translates into top performer, effective communication. If you want employees to be their best selves, which translates into better work product and a bottom line, then you have to focus on their psychological safety. Make sure they feel like they belong, which ultimately turns into having good self-esteem. So there is a book by Timothy Clark, and to be honest, there is not a ton of stuff out there on psychological safety these days. So he seems to have that market cornered with his book. There's so much more to be discovered and to talk about related to psychological safety. So it's, again, just a new term that we're using a lot lately, but it's important. And it's been something that's been researched for many years. I just think that phrase psychological safety is sort of new, but Dr. Clark talks about inclusion safety. So he's saying we have to feel included. We have to feel like people love us and care about us. And once we feel that way, where we feel safe that, hey, these people include me and value me, only then can you start to really learn. So learner safety means that you have the ability to ask questions, that if you're asked to try something new, that you have the courage and feel empowered to go and try that new thing. And if you make a mistake while you're learning and doing, that you're not going to be reprimanded for that. So people can't learn if they're not in a psychologically safe environment. If they don't feel like they can ask questions or talk to their boss or get some coaching on how to do something, then they're not going to learn. So they have to feel included. Once they feel included, then they are more open to learning. And once they're able to learn, then they can start to contribute. So as they're learning, they start, processing that information that they're learning, and then they can start to contribute to the organization. They can start to share ideas, have some sort of crazy idea that might work, push back on the status quo. And then that leads us to challenger safety. So you're only going to have people feeling comfortable to challenge the status quo or challenge why something is done a certain way if people feel safe to contribute. So these are the levels of Dr. Clark. And so he's, again, ultimately saying people have to feel included and like they belong before they can participate in your organization to the full extent that you probably need and want them to. Now, researchers love their climbing staircases here of models. I'm going to share with you a different model. So this is a model from a woman, Barbara Fredrickson, who talks about, her model is called Broaden and Build, and it's very well accepted in the world of positive psychology. And so what Barbara Fredrickson put out there, and which has been studied and sort of solidified in the world of positive psychology, is that if you feel positive, your brain opens up, right? So if you're feeling good, your brain sort of expands and you're able to think through the various possibilities and actions that you could potentially take. What are the various pathways available to me to overcome a challenge or to problem solve? And with that large list of options coming to you is because you have positive emotions. And whenever you pick the action that you're going to take, then you've learned from that process. You've built a repertoire of resources, essentially. So let's say I have a customer problem. Because I feel positive, my brain opens up to a wide array of options. I pick one of those options. I successfully solve the customer problem, the customer challenge. And so now I have a new tool in my tool belt, a new way to look at things, because, hey, that worked. I was able to solve that problem. And then from there, I can continue to transform and grow. So then I have more positive emotions, right? Because I feel good about myself that I was able to solve that customer issue. And this is, of course, directly related to fight or flight, essentially, which we all know if you're anxious about something or fearful of something, if you're in defense mode and your choices feel like fighting and fleeing are the only options, that's your reptilian brain at work. So if you're afraid, then we feel a threat. That causes anxiety, and it causes us to defend ourselves, and we're either fighting or fleeing, fighting or flighting. And so this is your instinct. So what's happening is if you're afraid, if you don't feel psychologically safe, then your only options become fight or flight. If you feel respected and valued and like you're contributing and people value your contributions, you have positive emotions and you're more able to figure out what are all the other options other than fighting or fleeing. So having positive emotions allows you to work through any sort of anxiety that you might have. So some signs that psychological safety might be lacking in your team or your organization include, distress that you can see, or people isolating themselves, absenteeism, low productivity, If people don't feel comfortable going to HR, I always I hate when I speak at conferences, for example, and I recommend doing some sort of employee survey or having an anonymous hotline. Oh gosh, if we open that up, then it's just going to open up a whole world of problems. So if you're thinking we shouldn't do a survey because there's a lot of bad stuff's going to come out of it, then people probably don't come to you as HR, and that's a sign that you should be doing it, right? If you're getting a lot of anonymous submissions, instead of to HR, and also definitely be looking at your exit interview data these days. So one thing the Great Resignation brings is a lot of opportunity for exit interview data, and then you can analyze and figure out where to go from there. So why don't people speak up when they experience bad behavior? Why, what are they afraid of? And the answer is lack of psychological safety. They don't have confidence that the organization will have their back, so they're fearing retaliation. I do think that there is a fear of looking weak by showing our emotions. So if we think about reporting harassment or bullying, for example, to HR is an emotional, traumatic process. And since we live in a world where we're not supposed to show emotions, when asking people to speak up and report it, you're asking them to violate some social norms. And so we got to think through that. Or, if you're feeling like you're not safe, that's emotional. We also often think that if there's enough people around that someone else will speak up, so then we don't have to. Making waves, we may have seen it has consequences. People definitely worry if they'll make things worse, and also your organization's norms. So again, if you're witnessing some poor behavior from a colleague, but you also witness that the VP is allowed to be a bully, then you're less likely to step in that sort of lower level issue because you can see that the organization doesn't care about behavior. So I definitely recommend your first tip for creating a psychologically safe work environment is to analyze organizational risk factors. And those result from policies, procedures, practices, and culture. So if your organization is doing something or not doing something that can cause bad things, then that's a risk factor. Here's some examples of risk factors. So this is there's a list of about 45 risk factors, I think, that I've seen at least over time. So, things that the organization is doing or not doing that actually facilitate bad behavior like bullying or harassment or a lack of psychological safety. So, for example, if you have a young workforce, they're haven't grown up yet. Their idea of what professionalism means is probably different than a 40-year-old's. Their hormones are raging. They're less likely to be married. There's a lot going on there with the young workforce. So if your organization is mostly young workforces or a young workforce, then that's a risk. That's something your organization is doing. You're hiring a young workforce that actually facilitates the opportunity for harassment to happen. So the first tip here then is to think through the risk factors. What is it that your organization is doing or not doing that actually hinders psychological safety? So I definitely recommend taking this list back to your leadership and figuring out what resonates with your organization. And if we're going to prevent harassment and bullying, if we're going to create an inclusive work environment, then you have to look at these types of risk factors and figure out where you can make changes in order to accomplish those things. Just to give you an example of how this comes into play is it is a very overt example. RevUp Inc. manufactures parts for race car engines all over the country, and they've been in business for over 50 years, and they attract a lot of male talent, many of whom are interested in learning more about cars and straight out of high school. They pride themselves on mentoring these individuals. So you see they're bringing in mostly males who are young. If there is a culture that is around, the young male mind where they're making perhaps inappropriate jokes or, engaging in behavior that maybe it's not professional. And then they're mentoring these individuals. These individuals are growing up in a world where that behavior is okay. And that culture is going to perpetuate. So this is an example of how culture can definitely facilitate bad behavior. So also understand that leadership behaviors undermine safety as well. So if leaders are quick to say no to suggestions, or they're defensive, or they're not actively listening, then they're undermining psychological safety. So your leaders have to be keen on their own personal behaviors and how those behaviors are helping or hurting organizational goals and psychological safety. And then the organization itself might not be embracing change, might not be developing a feedback-oriented culture. They might be not addressing complaints or feedback. And so, the organization, again, itself can be doing things. So my first tip for you then I guess my second tip is to conduct an assessment to figure out. So take a look at those risk factors. Also conduct an assessment that looks at psychological safety. So if you're doing an employee engagement survey, that's great, but it's probably not measuring psychological safety. So don't confuse the two. If you're going to do a survey, that makes you a social scientist, and a good social scientist will they'll have a research question, and then they design a survey around that. So if you're doing an engagement survey, then the research question is, what are the levels of engagement in our organization? If you're looking at psychological safety, there's different questions to ask. So these are some examples of some of the questions that we ask in our surveys. These are questions that would get to, or statements that we're asking people to rate, that would get to whether or not people feel psychologically safe. And I've got a few more here for you. All right. I also recommend doing interviews as part of your survey. So we always do surveys with a list of randomly selected employees. And so we'll get an entire list of the employees, and then we just go through and randomly select them, basically by choosing a number. I know it's very social science oriented. But so then what we do is we take all of that data and we move it all into themes, so that it makes the information a lot easier to digest. So a lot of survey vendors don't do that. They just give you a printout of all of the data, or all of the open-ended questions, responses. So we take those open-ended responses, and we take our survey or our interview data and turn it all into a document that looks like this. And then we're able to really look at where are the challenges and what needs to change. So that's the second piece of assessing psychological safety. Sorry, I'm looking at my phone. It keeps lighting up on me. One thing to consider as you're assessing psychological safety is to dig into that deeper from the DEIB space, and look at, how are you going to understand what barriers are in place to inclusivity and equity? You can't uncover them if the whole leadership team is, a white male group, for example. So you're going to need people with diverse backgrounds to understand those barriers. Also consider how whiteness might be a norm in your organization, and how can you change the social norms? So I actually had a conversation with a client yesterday. We're going to be doing training around civility and communication skills. And he talked about the fact that he uses the word professional a lot. And we were talking about incorporating professionalism into this training that we're going to be doing. And, he pointed out that professionalism, or we talked about the fact that professionalism can come across as sort of white standards, suit and tie, and who decides what professionalism is. And so we talked about how fun it would be in this training to discuss with his group. There's 100 employees there. What does professionalism mean here in this organization? It doesn't mean you have to send a super formal email that says, "Dear Sir," and it doesn't mean you have to wear a tie. And in fact, he said they really pride themselves on sort of informal relationship building type of communication. And so we're going to be able to go through this process of like, you have to be professional, but what does that look like here in this organization? Because it might be different than in a different organization. So these are the types of things you want to be thinking about. Also, something that I'm super passionate about is your manager training. So consider that when somebody files a harassment prevention complaint, for example, that they go and get a human resources person or an investigator who comes in and focuses on the facts. The investigator's role is to interview people like a detective and figure out who was where, when, and whether or not what was said was said. Did it happen or not happen? Can that be proved? So it's all about the facts, like a detective in a police case, right? And while we have to do that, certainly we have to figure out if something happened or didn't happen. It really overlooks the fact that this stuff is all a social phenomenon and that perceptions matter too. So I always say we operate in a world of perceptions, which helps us do our jobs. We're not investigators. We're not here to do facts, but don't get so caught up in that, because the facts, perception's reality. And if your perception is that we're not psychologically safe here, that this person's always acted that way, that's going to influence that investigation and the facts around it. I think we also really underestimate the power that managers have to influence culture. We always say culture comes from the top. Culture comes from the top. And sure, it does in some way, shape, or form. But if your managers are managing in certain ways, then the managers have the ability to influence the culture inside their own teams or with each other. Managers can sort of pair up and work together to say that this is the culture we're going to create down below. Because if the leader at the top is a bully or aggressive or doesn't seem to care about the human element of the company, then you can buffer that as a manager by having, training managers to act and interact in a certain way. So managers should really be taught how to facilitate culture inside their own teams. And they should be taught how to combat negative behavior. Managers, I rarely meet a manager that's literally been trained on how to coach poor behavior. Lots of them have been trained on performance management, how to have a disciplinary conversation, but that's not coaching poor behavior. So we're really underutilizing the managers in our organizations. So managers absolutely need training around setting expectations, managing incivility and bullying, coaching behavior, as well as performance, and what are the actions they can take to create a positive work environment. So again, the training's always so focused on what not to do. If there's a harassment complaint, here's what you do. But why aren't we focusing on what we do want, which is a positive workplace? So give your managers the tools for that. And then everyone needs training on all sorts of things like conflict management, communication skills, customer service. So training is a piece of creating psychological safety, but it's not the solution. Sorry, another tip is for you to develop a list of action items based on your data, and you're going to do that with an action team. So don't, gather all the leaders and then you figure out how to change the survey data. Instead, figure out how to create a strategic plan with the input of your employees. So when we work with clients, we have this action team, and it's made up of some leaders and people all throughout the organization. So it really represents the organization's makeup in all sorts of ways: levels, departments, race, gender, etc. And from there, we build a strategic plan. So, for example, one of our clients that we did this with, we had done the survey, and then we needed to figure out, how do we help you influence the culture? How do we make these changes? So the action team came up with, I think there were 5 objectives total. Here are 3 of them. One was to build trust in the process of change. And then you can see a couple goals underneath there. So for example, if we're going to focus on building trust in changing the culture, then one of the goals had to be focused on healing. And another goal was increasing transparency. The second objective was to build empathy and respect into everyday behavior. So a goal there was to increase awareness and empathy. The action item under that was training. Hold directors accountable to team culture. Some action items under that were that the directors would be doing more management by walking around, holding skip level meetings at random. So those are the types of action items that ultimately came out of that objective. A third objective was to create equity in the people processes. So some of the goals under that objective were things like adjusting performance management, ensuring that there was diversity in hiring, and so forth. And just to show you some examples of the action items under objective 3. So you have your objectives, your goals, and then what are the action steps to get to those goals. We worked with the organization to create a competency matrix that was tied to core values, empathy, and respect. So as part of their performance management system now, when people were measured on their performance, they were also going to be measured on whether or not they lived the company core values, whether or not they exemplified empathy and respect. And so we were taking essentially psychological safety and empathy and these types of positive behaviors and turning them into something that we could measure the employees on and the leaders. So it's just a way to create accountability. We crowdsourced job boards so that the entire organization, there was 900 people. They were all able to contribute to this job board. It was just sitting on a Google Drive, super easy. So all of these employees had clubs and things they knew about and places to go, places where we could be posting job openings so that we could bring in more diverse people. Another option was, or another action item that we did was interview questions as well. We also crowdsourced interview questions so that when the organization was interviewing leaders, they could ask questions around their ability to be inclusive. So here's an example of how that panned out. And I just want to share this with you because I know culture feels pretty intangible, but it can be very tangible. And that's, one of the things that we bring. We're able to help turn something so intangible into a tangible thing. But, after about 18 months, we did a second survey, excuse me, and saw lots of improvement, or that people just sort of felt that it was improving. So we were pretty proud of that. Let's see, we had 55% were agreeing, whether somewhat or strongly. So that was good. We still had a lot of work to do, that's for sure. But that was a step in the right direction. Also very proud of some of this work to show off as well. So in the original survey, we found that the Black workforce really saw the organization very differently. So for example, they believed that there was more harassment related to ethnicity. There was a little bit more bullying than the other groups. And they felt that compared to the other groups, the Black workforce felt that the leadership team wasn't building relationships or using the right strategies to build relationships with them. They saw that there was less of a commitment to DEI than the other groups, and so on and so forth. And then after working with the organization for about 18 months, that really changed. And the Black workforce, through efforts of mostly their director, really honed in on this and wanted to make sure they felt included and psychologically safe. The director of the team where most of the Black workforce was really dove into this. And so we were able to really influence how they saw the workforce. So we decreased the perception of harassment and decreased or increased the relational strategies that leadership was using, and so on. And then in terms of gender, we also saw that females believed that there was a whole lot of bullying going on. So 4 represented that they experienced bullying weekly, and then 5 represented daily. So women were saying that they were being bullied essentially every week. And through working with us and coming up with the strategic plan and executing it, we were able to minimize the bullying in the workplace for both men and women. So those are some bigger picture organizational things that you can do. As an individual, you can also certainly participate in building a psychologically safe workplace. You can do that by showing employees they're valued with just your communication style, making eye contact, taking suggestions, and so on, and being transparent about the things that you do. If you're shutting people off without explaining why, then you're inhibiting psychological safety. You can also be an ally in meetings. So I just joke that meetings are a cesspool of microaggressions and inappropriate behavior, but it's often so subtle you don't notice it. And so if you start to really pay attention in meetings, you'll notice how much sort of I was going to say inappropriate behavior, but how much of the behavior that hinders psychological safety actually occurs. And so, I mean, even just yesterday, for example, because I'm very in tune with meetings, and I'm always sort of watching as the social scientist that I am. Yesterday, a male made a comment about, we were talking about, I think it was high level salespeople or something. And someone asked the question and used the word guys in the question. I'm sorry, I'm not articulating very well, but it was essentially saying to the guys that you work with in those positions, blah, 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 blah. And it just struck me like, well, but you didn't say gals. You just said guys. Gals can be high powered too. So that was a tiny little microaggression. He certainly meant nothing by it, but it was a chance for me to say, hey, and I just kind of poked fun at him. Hey, I'm here too. Women can have those roles. And he sort of, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. You're right. Anyway, so that's an example of these little subtle things that happen in meetings all the time. So one thing you can do is make sure that you're amplifying the ideas of the people who deserve the credit. So if somebody did a bunch of work and somebody else, like their boss, is taking credit for it, then you can help amplify. You could say something like, hey, I know that Jenny did a lot of work on that project too. I'd love to hear from Jenny what her thoughts are, and so you sort of take the power from the person who's taking all the credit and remind everyone that Jenny did it too. Or often the plight of women, we all have stories of having an idea, it's essentially ignored. And then 20 minutes later, a male in the room brings up a very similar, if not the same idea, and all of a sudden it's a good one. Feel free to jump back and say, oh, good, Bob, I'm so glad you brought that up. I was worried that when Jenny brought it up, we weren't going to, be talking about it. I was worried it would get brushed under the rug. So I'm glad that you brought Jenny's idea back up. So that's a way to remind everyone that, hey, Jenny, the woman in the room, actually had the idea first. Respond to showboating by pointing out experience of others. So I have another meeting that I attend monthly where there's definitely a grandstander, a showboater. He loves to talk about how amazing he is and the work that he does. And so I often am the one who pops in and says, I think, somebody else does works just similar to that. Have you met with them? You should talk to them because I've heard some really great reviews about their stuff as well. So just drawing attention away from them so they're not able to grandstand and step on others. Uh-oh, my computer is not, there we go. Another thought is to rotate administrative duties. So lots of women out there have all had this experience where they've been asked to take notes simply because they're the woman. I've spoken to many CHROs who through their career have been asked, as the VP of HR, for example, to take notes, even though there's someone way lower level than them in the room, but they're male, so it's left to the woman. So one way to just avoid that is to rotate the duties of taking notes. And then another tip in meetings is to kick questions to the right person. So often what happens is maybe the white male in the room gets asked a bunch of questions about a project from the client. And meanwhile, the person of color in the room is the one who knows all the stuff and probably executed the project. So if the client is addressing questions towards the white male, you could easily say, hey, Jason did most of the work on that. So let's get Jason to answer that question. Or if you're the white male being asked, you could say, hey, Jason's the one who's got the answer. Let's hear from him. I also suggest, lastly, as part of creating a psychologically safe work environment, that you make room for emotions, especially now. And I've been saying this since before COVID. You can't expect people to be fully honest with you as an employer if you don't allow them to be psychologically safe. If you don't make it clear that you're interested in their emotions and feelings, then why would they open up to you? So these types of things that we want employers to tell us about, we have to be okay with the kind of emotions and trauma that comes with those things and not be afraid of that. And so we've really drawn this line where it's like, hey, we want you to report it to us, but it's got to be all facts and in this way. And we sort of forget about all the emotions that go with it. So you got to make room for emotions and trauma in your workplace if you're going to create psychological safety. So in the end, I have a fantastic little assessment for you. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to send it to you. And it's just, a way to really break down what respect really even means. So for example, if you're being honest with yourself, and one of the questions there is, do you instill confidence in others? It's easy to go, well, sure, I'm a good leader, but how? Really think that through. How are you instilling confidence in others? Do they believe you when you say you'll do something? Do you keep your word? Do you instill confidence if you're a leader? Do people believe that you have the ability to lead them somewhere? And so it's really breaking down what respect might look like, and asking you to consider those various facets of respect. So do please shoot us an email. Check out our website if you'd like. I hope that this webinar was helpful for you. Let's see. Oh, I did freeze. Oh, and I didn't realize questions were coming through. I did not see them over there in StreamYard. Jada, thanks for your question. How do you measure increasing transparency? I think you absolutely can measure that. So for example, you can have survey statements where people are rating questions like, I get the information I need to do my job well. Another statement might be, I have a full understanding of the decisions that are made and why they're made. So I think we could, like if I was to work with you, for example, Jada, we could talk about what kinds of things we want people to be transparent around, and then we can definitely measure if that's actually happening. It reminds me of another client where we're hearing a lot of the leadership team doesn't take in feedback. And so, of course, the leadership team is thinking, well, what does that mean? What can we have some specifics? And so we thought, maybe part of the process of digging into that, we're going to be doing stay interviews, but part of the process is to ask a question like, and provide different things. Like if I give feedback about a client project, I feel it's heard. If I give feedback about an organizational process, I feel it's heard. And so we're kind of coming up with all the things that feedback might entail so that we can specifically give information to leaders that this is the kind of feedback where people are feeling they're not heard. So hopefully that answers your questions. Happy to respond more offline if you'd like. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to interacting with you on LinkedIn and building a friendship with you. Thanks. Have a great day.